And so our next speaker comes to us from the International Air Transport Association, Mr. Raimonds Gruntins, and he's a long-standing friend of the school. He's been here many times, and he's the Director of Regional Affairs in Europe for IATA. So, welcome, Raimonds.
Kiitos. Good morning. Oops. Pleasure to be here, second time. Kiitos, Päivi, for interesting presentation. Actually, what we should probably do is to compare slides, because I said what I'm going to talk about, because you did all the speaking. Yeah. But what I wanted to say is it normal sound? Sorry, because I feel that I'm shouting like completely. But anyways, I just wanted to say that Finnair has done an amazing job internationally, and sometimes when I used to still be based in the Northern Europe, oftentimes I can experience that at the home level, the carriers is probably least appreciated. Finnair has actually been very known internationally for its visionary thinking when it comes to tackling the global sustainability issues. So I just wanted to make a point on that. My name is Raimonds Gruntins. I'm currently based in Madrid, but I also have two hats, because I'm still the managing director for the IATA here in Nordic and Europe. So actually I have been quite involved in the discussion on sustainability. And if you would allow me, Päivi, I just wanted to reflect a couple of things that you said, about sustainability. And you said technology plays a huge role, and it is true. But and then you spoke about the perceptions, right? How aviation is perceived, and there are misconceptions. So one thing that I just wanted to make sure before I actually go to the presentation is that globally, of course, aviation emits emissions. But globally, it's responsible for 2% of the global mankind-made aviations. So in terms of proportionality, probably you need to think if the noise is adequate to the proportion of the emissions as well. And you were also speaking about investing in the new technologies, which makes perfect sense. And we did a study globally, what would be the profit margins that the industry brings. There's lots of operations. And in Europe in 2018, which was probably the best year ever in our history, the average profit margin is 5.72 cents per ticket. And on then that profit margin, airlines have to buy new aircraft. They have to, pay bonuses or invest in summer camps. But that's a question that I just wanted to make sure that we realize the very, very thin profit margins, okay? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to speak about the responsible aviation and what industry does to, from the global perspective. And I will probably jump over a couple of slides because you've seen, and I will try not to repeat what Päivi has said, because generally it does apply for industry, in general. And that's, surprise, surprise, the same slides in different colors, so I'm going to skip that. But aviation is a global player, and obviously there's lots of activity taking place every day and every minute, and so the whole business sense of it is very, very active. So I'm not going to read in the slide again. I'm going to try to jump to probably something more interesting. I also wanted to revisit a little bit what we spoke here last year about sustainable development goals and what aviation takes part in those sustainable aviation goals. Obviously, those are the goals that were developed by United Nations, and we had last year's seminar only talking about those, and we went into the detail. I just wanted to show the slide as a continued for the last year's discussion, and on the right side, you basically see the level of activities where we believe aviation takes a crucial role. So not all of them apply, but majority of the sustainable development goals for this planet are touched or influenced by aviation. So what is the global air transport industry? Päivi already spoke about the millions of jobs. And what the message usually what we're delivering to the governments are that it is a very strong economical drive, and if we can look at aviation globally, then 3.6% of the global wealth is actually generated by aviation-driven businesses. And an interesting fact would be, if aviation would be a country for its own right, then it would be the size of Switzerland and Poland. So we usually use the argument when we are talking to politicians, saying, listen, we are probably not the most attractive ones at the moment, but we are still to be considered for the fueling and for the engineering of the economies. Here, since this is a campus that is focusing on aviation, I think one thing that I like to tell about also, not because we always speak about passengers, but what is quite significant that air cargo is a very, very nice economical indicator. And basically, almost 35% of the global trade in the terms of value is actually going by the cargo, which is only one kind of, which is only 0.5% of the 0.5% in the volumes. So basically, it's very lightweight, but lots of value. That means that cargo does generate lots of economical movement. And obviously, another dimension is that aviation is business of freedom. It makes people move, it makes people connect, it enables people to actually, interconnect, exchange ideas, values, experiences, and actually build the world as a better place. And today, 57% of the global travel is actually happening by air. So that is also directly linked how we are building more sustainable economical development in the world. We spoke about lots about the investments in the future, but obviously, since aviation is very competitive business, it has lots of competition. And what we believe is that aviation is truly global industry that opens the borders. And here you can see the slide on the slide how the average prices of the tickets have developed over past 50, 60 years. So it means that today it's probably 10 times more less expensive to travel. And since 1950, ticket prices went down 90% comparing to what the prices are today, which means that more and more people are able to travel and have the benefit of movement. So the message here is that the industry does think about sustainable future, but also it thinks about giving better value to its customers. Make sense so far? Okay. This was... there's a lots of things saying what happens to aviation basically in next 20 years, and obviously today Europe is responsible for 26% of the global traffic, which is very significant for us, but the future is slightly different because the growth is happening, but it's happening from the east. And if we generally said that aviation markets are US and Europe in the past, that will change, obviously. It is very saturated market, but developments are, and the growth potentials are there, but probably not as much in Europe compared to other regions. And if we would be kind of looking over the years when the epicenter of the aviation goes, you can see that gradually it moves to the east. Giving you an example that those who've been in industry or around traveling, I mean, for a longer time, if I would ask 20 years ago, who would know where Abu Dhabi is? You know, probably, yeah. Do you know that Abu Dhabi airport? No, probably no. And there was a whole population in India, for example, 20, 15 years ago, who would travel to the States using airports as Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam. That is not happening anymore today. Everybody goes by Dubai, Turkey, or Istanbul. So the activity is shifting from the west to the east. And when we looked at the global developments on the global projections on the passengers, how we're going to grow, we actually examined 3 different scenarios. One scenario is if we do lots of liberalization, basically we are working on policies that liberalizes traffic, where it's a little bit more conservative kind of approach, and where's the protectionism. And even in the case where governments would decide we want to protect our market, we will still double the growth. The question here is where this growth is going to happen, and whether countries, as the Nordic countries, will take benefit of the growth or they will impede it. But the question again is that which I would always like to argue with the Nordic governments is that is fine if you decide not to travel, but there are billions of people who never traveled before, and do we have a moral right of prohibiting them to travel? And I think that is not right, because the Western societies reap the benefit of being, moving around and doing businesses, and there's a whole world out there who has not had this benefit yet. So the growth will happen. The question is, do you want to be part of it or you don't? And if you be part of it, can you be socially, economically, and environmentally responsible? So we are predicting that by 2036, there will be actually 97 million jobs supported by the industry, and that is a huge economical stability factor. And that will mean that there will be 5.7 trillion GDP dollars contribution to the economic activity. And those are figures that usually we don't comprehend. And the question is, would you want to risk that? Or would you like to want to impede the development and actually strip the world from gaining these benefits? So globally, we were looking at the impacts and scenarios, what we have done in terms of minimizing risk. And Päivi already spoke about the new technology. The question is that obviously, if you run an operation which runs on fuel, and fuel probably represents 40% of the airline's cost, then it's no surprise that we would do everything to minimize the fuel consumption by any means. Obviously, less used fuel is more sustainability, and the fact is that since the time when jet engines were introduced, industry runs 80% more economic operations than they used to be. So 80% less emissions, 80% more efficiency by changing the technology. Once again, you spoke about the goals and pillars. It has actually been agreed globally in the industry that everyone came together, ACI, which is Airport Council, producers, different airlines, and they all signed the agreement that yes, we'd like to commit to the global goal and reduce emissions, and we'd like to work on it from the perspective that we'd like to take collective responsibility. And why I'm saying this, because as far as I know, there is no other sectors that has done that. We never had a collective agreement for reducing emissions. It only happened in aviation. So there are 3 goals and 4-pillar strategy that we have agreed. And the first one is to reduce the annual emissions by 1.5% annually. At the for 2018, it actually was, I think, the average reduction was in 3% already. The second goal is to basically not emit more starting from 2020. And by 2050, reduce the emission levels by 50% compared to 2005 emission levels. And I understand that on the paper that looks okay, but those are enormous commitments. And once again, no other industry has done the same kind of commitment to the global sustainability. And the 5 pillars obviously are technology, infrastructure, sustainable fuels operations, and market-based measures. And if you don't have that combination together, then probably there is going to be very difficult to achieve those targets. We start with technology. Enormous developments in terms of how the fleet has developed. Finnair uses 350, much more economical aircraft, longer range, less consumption. But once again, we need to remember that the profit margins generally are $6 per ticket, and you need to make investments based on the available funds. Sustainable aviation fuels, it has to be responsibility of the society to demand more sustainable fuels in the stock, because the problem is that airlines can fly on sustainable aviation fuels, but there's just not the supply. And we as an industry are calling for governments to actually try to regulate the question and try to create the supply, because is that really the airline's responsibility alone? Operations, as I mentioned, Finnair has been frontrunner in setting the standards. World is following that closely. Weight operations, closer routes. And operations, I actually want to mention a fact about Europe Union's ambition of reducing emissions, which we think is a wonderful idea. But at the same time, I'm a little bit puzzled by the hypocrisy of the commitments as well, because Europe has spoken about the single European sky, basically setting up the system when airlines can fly much more direct routes. Today that is not the case, because each government kind of protects its territory in the sky. So airlines are actually making the zigzag routes, and if we would implement single European sky, then automatically we could reduce emissions by 25%, just getting your legislation right. So there's this also basically pressures that we need to put to the governments. Infrastructure. I'm really looking forward to hear Raisa from the Istanbul airport, but infrastructure is on the air and on the ground as well. So obviously, airlines do fly, but they need to land as well eventually somewhere. So the infrastructure is enormously important, that we have the right infrastructure in place that can provide with the sustainable aviation fuels, where the taxi time makes sense, where you don't need to taxi for a long time, but you need to wait or circle around in the sky, making unnecessary emissions. So it's a whole ecosystem that is super important. And the last, obviously, slide that I'd like to share is the market-based measures and how different components of the effort are reflected in the savings. So once again, the success for responsible aviation is the holistic approach on the issue. You cannot just work on the biofuels or market-based measures without looking at the whole value chain holistically. And obviously, market-based measures globally are the things that the industry is really fighting for. And when I'm saying this, because for a global industry, there has to be a global measure. And why is that important? Because airlines come across different countries. And by distorting the market and saying one regulation in one country, another regulation in another country, simply airline is not able to compete sustainably. Giving you a simple example, if Finland would decide, for example, that they will tax all the aviation fuels here in Finland, for example, what would happen? Obviously, Finnair would need to fuel, but other carriers wouldn't. They probably would fuel somewhere else, load aircraft full of you call it fuel, and then fly with much heavier aircraft and pollute more. So it has to be the similar measures globally, because altogether we can tackle the sustainability questions, but that has to be a collective responsibility. So that was actually my last slide. And do we have some time for questions?
Yeah, I think we can at least have 2 questions if we just have some. Does anyone have any questions at the moment?
Which is either bad or good sign, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, we'll have some questions in the afternoon then. Oh, there's questions.
Sorry.
Okay.
Hi, Jason Papadopoulos from Finnair. Question on your views. What's holding the single European sky back?
That's a good question, right? I think at one point I've been quite puzzled with the thing, because I think it's almost a curse. Whenever we call it single European sky, then things don't move. But I think it's a mixture of questions. I think there's also lots of national pride, because if we are the European Union, we still hold to the positions of air traffic controllers, for example. And we make silly rules, for example, saying that traffic controllers in Germany have to speak German. Why? Because everything is in English. So if there's a shortage of traffic controllers, the rule impedes them to import traffic controllers from the rest of the EU, for example. And that happens in all the countries. So there's this national kind of protectionism of the airspace as one thing. And I think it's just very difficult to agree between different states. I don't really know. I think that is a question that we as a society need to ask more our politicians, because we've been speaking about it for 20 years and we haven't progressed. And that's really a shame, because it's in infrastructure. And the most sad thing is that you, as a passengers, you get to the flight, you sit in your seat, you buckle, and then you see the skies and you see the clouds and the sound, and it's nice. But what you don't see is actually that the pilot is going like nuts sometimes around, and we don't see it as a passenger. I mean, if I go to Helsinki in a car and there's a traffic jam on a road, or road renovation, then I say, damn, why don't you have the infrastructure right? Because I'm late for work. You don't see that as a passenger. So emotionally, there's a little bit, there's probably less, political pressure. I don't know if it makes sense, but.
Right, thank you. Unfortunately, we have to move on with the program, and thank you for the positive presentation. It had many good points. So, give a warm applause for